The UN Secretariat building, sorry, am I saying that right? UN Secretariat building, or was
Yes.
it UN General Assembly?
No, the Secretariat, well, there's three buildings. Secretariat building, General Assembly, and Conference building.
Were all the subject of a deep energy retrofit?
Yes.
Okay.
But the Secretariat is the one that won the award for tall building.
Well, the Secretariat being the chief example, but of all the UN retrofits, where did that push for that project come from? Was that from the UN internally? How did that project come to be?
The UN building was getting old, about 65 years old when the discussion started. And it was actually 60 years old, and the discussion was going on for years about tear it down, renovate it, and then 9/11 happened, and the mayor of New York came to the UN and said, you must fix it up, whether you're going to tear it down or fix it up, you better do something, because I'm not going to send my first responders in if it's going to be risky. And we were well behind on building code compliance. So the member states, over the next couple of years, after 9/11, decided they're going to keep their building. They were going to do the green thing to do, and the sustainable and the iconic thing to do is to preserve the building, and then they started moving forward. So the decision was made to some extent by the mayor of New York, although because he had the power of first responders to a blast.
And what's been the takeaway since the retrofit was completed? Has the UN applied any of the lessons learned in that project to other buildings they own around the world?
I think the voluntary compliance with building codes and with having voluntary inspections, which were called visits rather than inspections, was very successful. We allowed the local building department to make sure that we were meeting code and meeting it honestly, and they wouldn't send us violations. They would send us letters of concern and other ways of doing it in a less formal way. It did allow the UN, which didn't want to start a precedent for all the international buildings all over the world that belong to countries, that we have 1,000 buildings in China. We have multiple buildings all over the world, and that we didn't want all countries to start inspecting, but we did want to conform to code. So I think that precedent was very nicely established, that everyone, more so in the rest of the world now, is voluntarily seeking compliance with the local building codes. And we're trying to learn from the lessons that the Capital Master Plan has learned and applying it to Geneva. Geneva is the next large, big project, hundreds of millions of dollars project in the UN to renovate the Palais in Geneva. And so that project is trying to use some of the lessons that we learned.
Tell us more about the challenges of renovating the Palais in Geneva. What sort of lessons from the UN General Plan Capital Plan that you're going to try to apply?
One thing is a budgetary lesson. We estimated the construction costs of the project as a developer would. Of course, there was going to be a developer who was going to build a building for us that would allow us to use it for swing space and then for office space. And so we were using the construction costs without the impact costs on all the other departments of the UN. Security has a major impact because they have more, during the construction, they have more buildings to secure because they have to secure the swing spaces. The people who do the conferencing services have more costs. All those costs we did not include in our budget. And the other departments thought the project, because it's the UN and they weren't thinking that this would ever really happen, they didn't put it into their budgets. So it was called the associated costs, and it was a very difficult, over $150 million for the General Assembly to figure out where to charge it to. Geneva has taken that to heart. They are incorporating all the costs of construction, which are not just bricks and mortar, but the costs of the disruption of the organization, which is quite significant on an organization where you have to move it left and right and move it and try to keep it out of the way of the construction activity. So it's a substantial cost.
That's really interesting consideration I hadn't thought about. And I wonder if you think it would be applicable to private development as well that doesn't have a push from a public agency like the UN, or if there are other lessons from the work that the UN's done on its buildings that could be adapted to the private development market.
I think it's a very important lesson, especially if you're taking a project where you're taking an existing building and either modifying it or tearing it down, but you have to think about the swing space and the security and the maintenance costs of dealing with two buildings for a period of years. So there is a complicating factor when you're dealing with an existing institution, especially government, whether it's city, state, or federal or international government, where it's tax dollars and the money is hard pressed. So you do have to justify it and you have to think ahead. So I think that was a very good lesson that we learned, and I think it's applicable in many projects.
Mm-hmm. And could you state the lesson again?
It's the lesson of the associated costs. It's the lesson that besides the construction and besides the cost of fitting out the building, there's the disruption to the organization of moving people, not just the swing space, not just renting and fitting out, but there's additional maintenance. Someone has to clean garbage cans. Someone has to clean the additional restrooms for 1,000. We had 1 million square feet of swing space, and that's a lot of additional costs. IT is spread out over 20 city blocks rather than one city block. So IT has to pay for the costs, which they didn't budget for.
So with that in mind, is there anything that new buildings today, or buildings that won't see the end of their life, or a viable reason to drastically retrofit or demolish them for some time, are there things that could or should be done for developers, architects to plan in advance for the end of a building's life?
I do think it's very important, especially for some of the taller buildings, which are very difficult to take down, which will require closing streets maybe for months or even a year, that the methodology for taking down the building eventually, which might be the system that you do allow for a larger elevator shaft, so you can drop everything down internally and not have to count on getting it outside in chutes, because you can't on a very tall building. There's no chutes. It would fly for miles. So that you do have to drop everything down the middle, as we do even on mid-sized buildings. So I think those things should be accounted for in the construction, and I think it should be building departments that require it, because I think as we do more and more skyscrapers, some are going to come down. And some are not going to come down in our lifetime, but they're going to come down, and it's going to be a very difficult process.